Hello, everybody. I'm Ron Brownstein, Senior Editor of The Atlantic. Thank you for joining us for the third installment of The Way Forward, a digital initiative hosted by The Atlantic in collaboration with Chatham House, Emerson Collective, and the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Emerson Collective is majority owner of The Atlantic. The goal of today's hour-long conversation is to explore what the COVID-19 pandemic means for another world crisis, climate change. There are many big topics to cover. Is there a relationship between pandemics and climate change? How does the coronavirus affect efforts to reduce carbon emissions to net zero by 2050? Does it delay these efforts or does it heighten their importance? How can industries and governments across the world take action together against these sequential threats? We're going to dive into these issues today with four experts. But before we do, I want to thank the Churchill Capital Corp, which has underwritten the event. And I want to remind our viewers that we want you to be part of the conversation as well. Type your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen and keep your questions short, on topic as possible. And we have an international audience here today, so we'd love to know where you're from as you ask your question. So with that, let me bring in our first guest, Dr. Ernest Moniz. He served as President Obama's Secretary of Energy, and he is now the CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Dr. Moniz has been advocating for what he calls a Green Real Deal, a counterpoint to the Green New Deal. We're going to talk about that as well as the relationship between climate change and pandemics. Dr. Moniz, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Ron.
Or this morning, my time, I guess this afternoon, your time. Let me start by asking you a question I think a lot of people are wondering. Is there a relationship between climate change and pandemics? Is there any evidence whether climate change makes us more susceptible to these kind of disruptive events?
Well, I think we don't really know the answer to that in terms of the science. Clearly, we do know that climate change affects all kinds of vectors in terms of insects and the like. We see that right now in the United States, unfortunately. But the connection from that to the kinds of biological organisms that create this kind of pandemic damage, at least I don't know of the strong science yet. Clearly, it's being researched. Obviously, there are so many other connections, including things like major population disruptions, which can be breeding grounds for spreading further pandemics and the like.
Other effects of climate, you mean, when you talk about kind of
Yes.
population disruptions, right?
Correct.
Yeah. As I mentioned in introducing you, you have been talking about a Green Real Deal that would build broad coalitions with business, put a price on carbon emissions, and support fuel sources like natural gas and nuclear power as transitions in order to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions over the next 30 years. You've called it, and here I quote, a broadly acceptable and practical plan. Give us the highlights of where you think we ought to be going.
Okay, well, Ron, first of all, I do want to say that we don't view it as a counterpoint. In fact, we actually say that we endorse the Green New Deal principles of climate and social justice being addressed in tandem. But the Green New Deal did not have what you'd call a program to implement it, and that's the Green Real Deal is our version of that. The Green Real Deal, as we put it forward, emphasizes a number of issues. One, you've already used the word practical, pragmatic.
Mm-hmm.
We insist upon that as being very important because we believe that to accelerate our addressing climate change will require broadly based coalitions. We never get systemic change that can stick without big coalitions. And so we need to bring a lot of different players under the tent. So coalitions are critical. Clearly, innovation is critical. Another thing we think is critical is regional solutions. Too often we hear one size fits all solutions for the United States or for different countries. That's just not the way it works. And that's why we need all the tools in the toolbox. We need, for example, carbon capture and sequestration. In a study we did about California specifically, frankly, I was surprised when it came back that we felt California moving on carbon capture and sequestration for both some power plants and some industrial facilities would be essential for California to be able to meet its 2030 goals of economy-wide reductions. So things of that type. And by the way, that also brings in coalitions. If I can just mention one other thing, in the Green Real Deal, we certainly make very prominent the importance of energy jobs. And by the way, of course, we had some new job numbers yesterday. Once again, not very attractive. But what's not in those numbers is if we look at clean energy, because at EFI, we do issue an annual energy and employment report. If you look at clean energy, we lost in March and April 1/6 of all the clean energy jobs in the country, roughly 600,000 jobs. So we lost double the gains made in the last 3 years. However, as we now aim to climb out of the economic hole caused by the virus, we believe that investing in that clean energy transition would be extremely effective because, for example, over the last 5 years, the growth in energy jobs has doubled the growth of the economy as a whole. So it's a great leverage point for investing in needed infrastructure and creating jobs.
You know, one of the questions that has come in right away from our viewers goes to that last point. Do you foresee that the post-COVID-19 way of life, the way that we're living is changing? Will that be helpful or harmful to a more green world and responding to the challenge of climate change?
Well, the reality is, let's face it, school is out on that. We'll see. However, some comments I think are in order. One is obviously the oil industry has been hit very hard. Now, I believe that the oil industry was heading for structural change in any case before the virus. The virus has emphasized the point that you can't operate a big business without cash flow. And so I believe that the industry will not come back to where it was. It will look different. But in looking different, hopefully, it will be recognized that we're still at the beginning of a secular change in which the oil industry is going to be profoundly altered as we go to very, very low carbon, to very, very low emissions. But in doing so, I will go back to carbon capture and sequestration. If you think about the skill set for the jobs in CCS, it's the same skill set as producing oil. So in other words, that's an example of a low carbon transition that can still preserve the basic job structure, for example, in many places. I think the question of low fossil fuel prices historically has led to an impact on renewables, EVs, et cetera. But, again, school is out, but I'm kind of bullish. I think that the reliability that one gets from things like renewable resources looks pretty good in the face of the volatility that we are seeing. That's only one example.
Can I follow right there? Because that was one thing I wanted to ask you, and some of our viewers, like Michael, was wondering. We are seeing this cratering of oil prices. Will that slow the transition toward cleaner energy sources if it's sustained for any length of time?
Well, again, the traditional argument would be yes, because it lowers the imperative to go there. But again, I think that first of all, I don't see any pulling back from things like renewable portfolio standards, which are often evolving into renewable portfolio standards. I mean, broader than renewables. I see the impetus for electric vehicles going on as the cost of ownership equals that of a combustion energy vehicle sometime in this decade. So I see that there are factors on that side as well. But as I said earlier, one should not forget the certainty and reliability that comes with so many of these clean energy technologies. That has enormous value. So I'm bullish in the end that we will be able to maintain our momentum. The question is, can we accelerate it? Because frankly, we're way behind pace in terms of where we have to go.
You know, one striking conclusion in your paper on the Green Real Deal is where you say, quote, "There are no clear silver bullet solutions to decarbonization at the present time. Multiple clean energy technology options are needed for each sector of the economy and region of the country." How does that core conviction shape your strategy on where you think we ought to go?
Oh, well, it's absolutely central, including the fact that while we certainly endorse the very important move towards, let's say, net zero for the electricity sector, and the electricity sector is and will continue to be what I would argue is kind of the lead horse in getting the whole economy to net zero, but it's insufficient. I just don't see that resolving the problems, let's say, of agriculture in terms of CO2 equivalents. Frankly, I think there are major challenges with a lot of the transportation sector. Air travel is an obvious one.
Right.
With very energy intensive industries, there will be challenges. I personally believe that the zero electricity system is going to have to be complemented by something that is I'll put a fuel in question marks, in quotation marks, excuse me. The quotation marks meaning it could be something like hydrogen, as an example. And so a clean electricity and a clean hydrogen sector together, I can see managing all the energy needs that we have in the economy. But that remains to be seen. There are other possible pathways. I would say that to reach net zero by mid-century, what we see in front of us today is not going to be enough. That's another part of our Green Real Deal. We are going to need a sharp focus still on innovation to produce new options. Among those, by the way, another report that we produced at EFI is, I think, the increasing attention given to carbon dioxide removal, let's say principally from the atmosphere, is going to be essential. In fact, I would argue the word net in net zero means it's almost a tautology that we will require large negative carbon technologies to reach that. And we have a long way to go to develop those at the scale and cost that we need. So that's another example of a major innovation pathway.
You talk about carbon pricing in your report. Peter, one of our viewers asks, can you explain the merits of carbon pricing, specifically bills that are being considered now in Congress?
Well, carbon pricing, many of us believe, ultimately is going to have to be a core federal policy to drive the low carbon transition. And frankly, those prices will need over time to go to values that are much larger than what is being talked about in terms of some of the starting places, like $20 a ton, et cetera. We'll have to go to higher. For example, the Schultz-Baker plan would start at $40 and escalate, and that is certainly, I would say, more in the ballpark. Now, in terms of in Congress, I mentioned Schultz-Baker. Schultz-Baker is a plan, for those who don't know, that suggests a carbon price, as we've said, but combines that with using the funds to go back to people as a flat dividend, that calls for carbon border adjustments, and that calls for some reduction of other regulations and incentives that one might not need with a carbon price. That's an interesting package. I will note that, and I will admit this is a bit of a concern, that right now, with the enormous fiscal hole that we are in because of the virus, to return to the virus, the idea of a new revenue source might be looking more and more attractive. And, for example, the Schultz-Baker $40, we're talking, $200 billion. So it's not 2 trillion, but it's a substantial amount, and that's an annual amount. However, the caution here, and I think this is where we need to really look at this, if a carbon price leads simply to deficit reduction, 2 problems with that. It's not directly, certainly, a job driver, nor is it progressive. Quite frankly, it is regressive, because the relative impact on lower income families would be higher, whereas the dividend approach would actually be net progressive in terms of the relative support for lower income families. So there's a lot. So a price is great and we need it, but there's a lot to discuss here in terms of how those funds are mobilized, and also what are the implications for regulation, et cetera, because I do not believe that one can just have a price. That is, one will need some additional regulations for quite some time, at least, especially for those sectors that are hard to decarbonize.
It would be an understatement to say that national policy in the U.S. is moving in the opposite direction from anything along the lines that we have been discussing. I'm interested in your sense of the timing of this. If, in fact, President Trump is reelected and continues to oppose any movement on any of these fronts for another 4 years, and the U.S. essentially stays out of the game for 4 more years through the earliest 2025, what would be the implications of that for the world's ability to avoid the worst outcomes over the long term?
Well, let me first start with my optimistic side, and note that it's not quite true that everything is going in the wrong direction, most especially in the innovation world, where there is strong, I think, bipartisan support. And in fact, quite bluntly, while the administration has consistently proposed to Congress every year a slashing of the energy research, development, demonstration budgets, the reality is Congress has not gone along with that, and in fact has increased those budgets. So I think that is an indicator also of the lurking support there is for addressing climate change, at least in addressing the solution. If the administration continues to oppose moving forward on carbon pricing or on other policies, obviously it will cost us more time, and time is of the essence. We are way behind, frankly, the pace again that we need. If we had the Paris meeting of 2020 to reevaluate the goals from 2015, there is no doubt that virtually the entire world would agree on the fact that we need much more ambition, and we need to up those goals. And in my view, in the United States, while the administration's position probably has been far less damaging than is often discussed, mainly because we do have the innovation agenda and we have the state-based agendas, again, renewable standards and the like, some of the regional cap and trade markets. So there's a certain stability there. But frankly, in the end, American leadership in the international realm is absolutely critical. And I think we need to have that leadership re-expressed as soon as possible.
Let me ask you, you mentioned, we have a question that relates to this from Taylor in San Francisco. You talked about some of the long-term energy possibilities, hydrogen, carbon capture, and sequestration. Between here and there, what is the role that you see for nuclear power in our energy mix?
Well, nuclear power, first of all, I do believe that we need to find ways to sustain the current plants, which are such a big part of our carbon-free generation. They have been for a long time, and they still are. And a separate story, not for now, but I think that's going to need a revisiting of the regulatory system for the electricity sector. That system was not really designed for the kind of technology mix we have today, especially with wind and solar and the like. So I think that's one issue. Now, there are the nuclear plants currently being built in Georgia, the 2 reactors, but frankly, I don't see any additional 1,000 megawatt or plus construction projects starting in this country for a long, long time. I am bullish on the so-called small modular reactors, some of the advanced so-called Generation 4 reactors, and they certainly have not proven themselves in terms of cost performance. They do look very attractive from a safety point of view, and I think that we are going to need a much stronger public-private partnership to at least get a couple of those plants to the demonstration phase, because we got to find out if that dog hunts, frankly, and can become a major part of the mid-century solution.
Secretary Moniz, thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it there for today, but thank you for joining us. Next, for a conversation on climate policy and carbon emissions in the U.S. and abroad, let's bring in Hal Harvey, the CEO of Energy Innovation. Hi, Hal.
Greetings, Ron. How are you?
Good, good. Let's see, are you on? Yes, there you go. So, we asked Secretary Moniz at the outset whether climate change was making us more susceptible to pandemics like this. Can I start by asking you the opposite, the inverse question? What do you think this pandemic is doing to our ability to respond to climate change?
Well, one hopes that we would begin to take climate change a little more seriously. The world's economy grinded to a halt with this tiny pandemic, these little cells. Climate change promises to be much worse and over a much longer time scale, but with quite different consequences. It will hit different regions at different times. So one of the things we have to do is make sure that the recovery that we create out of this is a green recovery. In other words, we should be alert to the possibility that things can change radically and rapidly. And if we don't begin to think about prevention instead of mop-up, we'll be in pretty deep trouble.
Talk about that in terms of, do you see the recovery as an opportunity to accelerate, the transition to a green economy? Certainly, there are going to be tremendous need to create jobs coming out of the largest unemployment since the Depression here and presumably in most countries around the world.
It's certainly a huge opportunity, but only if we grasp it. The Europeans are planning something they call the Green Deal, nothing new about it. They will commit over $1 trillion to this, and it's already been supported by more than half the member states. It's not been passed into law yet. And this morning, I just went through the Chinese stimulus numbers. They're devoting over $2 trillion to a green recovery. What's important about this is you're building the capital stock that sets future energy consumption patterns. Capital stock has long turnover time, cement plants, power plants, the car fleet, the truck fleet, refrigerators, buildings especially. So if you want to bend the curves on their carbon emissions, you have to start today. We have this massive influx of cash to the economy. We can make these investments for tomorrow, or we can squander the money for today. And it's a fundamental choice that we have not yet landed on here in America.
I don't think anybody would look at this last few months and say it has been a model we're going to be studying in 50 years on international cooperation, dealing with a global challenge. More likely the opposite. I'm interested in what you think, if anything, this tells us about the ability or the requirements, really, the preconditions that are necessary to get the world to cooperate on something as big as climate change.
Well, the first thing one has to do is recognize that there are some international negotiations and agreements that are zero-sum games, who gets which piece of territory. There are others which are positive-sum games, that both sides win and win big if they work together. And clearly, the COVID pandemic is a positive-sum game. In other words, it's better for everybody if every country has a smart program, if we pool knowledge on developing a vaccine, if we think about the restructuring of the travel industry and so on together. The same is emphatically true with climate change. There's no one country that can solve it, although the US can do as much as anyone. But we, in fact, depend on China to do their part. They depend on us. We both depend on Europe and the Middle East and so forth. So that's the first part, is begin to think about the nature of the solution, which should then lead to a political response.
We have a lot of questions, as we did for Dr. Moniz, around the theme of how the world changes after this, the ways the world changes after this, and whether that will improve or lengthen the odds of our being able to make progress against climate. For example, Daniel asks, what about the redesign of cities, towns, and how we live and the kind of spaces we create? Could that greatly reduce our energy consumption. And Paula Rance asks, globalism requires the long distance transports of good. Has anybody measured the contribution to climate change of the transport of products around the globe, and whether, if supply chains are disrupted and brought more closer to home, whether that would reduce some of those pressures? I'm interested responding specifically to those, but your broader thoughts on some of the pluses and negatives we might see of the way we respond to COVID-19 and how that will affect the climate fight.
These are great questions. Let me deal with the form of cities question first. One of the consequences of the pandemic is the streets are empty. It's quieter out, and people are discovering that the streets can be used for more than just cars. Kids can play, you can ride a bike, you can get around more easily, you can take a nice long walk. And I think once people have a taste of what a city can be like, they may demand more of it. I mean, think of it, when we go on vacation, we like to go to cities we can walk and where we can sit at a sidewalk cafe. But we come back home and we forget all about that. That's a little bit crazy. So first point I would say is, let's remember the public space is for all the public, not just the people that are sitting behind the wheel. So there's a neat possibility there. The question about supply chains, the energy in moving goods is relatively small because you can put so many TVs on a ship and send it across the ocean. But there's a deeper question of embedded energy in the production of goods, which gets to the composition of whatever you're making, the washing machine, the bicycle, the toothbrush, but also to the energy system from which it's imported. So some companies have started to demand that their supply chain get green, step by step, right? All the way from the mine mouth to the consumer. And the bigger, better ones have had a huge influence, a significant influence, not nearly big enough, on other countries and other suppliers. And I think making this a more vigorous push, including using national policy, would make a huge difference.
You know, to your point about kind of the livability of cities, there's interesting data from the International Energy Agency. Overall, they project, I think, an 8% decline in emissions this year because of so many people staying at home and so much commerce being disrupted. But in March, they said Paris saw a CO2 drop of 72% compared to normal. Much more than even New York, which is heavily on lockdown. I'm just wondering what that says about the way energy is being used around the globe, and you know, if there are lessons going forward. I mean, can more cities kind of emulate the walkable cities, as you suggest?
There's no question. The first place for action is in the countries that are building new cities like crazy. So China is going to add 300 million people to its cities in the next 25 or 30 years. In other words, one USA. The current topology of Chinese cities is based on the old Soviet model of single-use super blocks, huge blocks surrounded by enormous boulevards. That's a recipe for a permanent traffic jam. And in fact, there was a 60-mile traffic jam in Beijing that took 11 days to unravel. The alternative is a much more porous, smaller street network like Barcelona or parts of San Francisco. And then giving significant elements of that to public transit so that it's faster than cars rather than slower, exclusive lanes for buses, for example, but also giving it back to the people in the form of micro-mobility. If you get on an electric bike, the hills flatten, long distances become short distances, and you've created a fantastic mobility machine, and electric bikes are booming. I spent 6 weeks in Paris recently teaching, and the mayor there, Anne Hidalgo, has made, I think, 300 kilometers of exclusive bike paths. Everyone's riding bikes. It's great.
Let me ask you, our next guests are international focus. So let's dig into US politics for a minute.
Yeah.
You know, I've written about the tendency of the energy producing states at this point to overwhelmingly send to Congress, to the Senate, Republicans who almost universally oppose any legislative action on climate change. If you look at the 20 states with the most per dollar, with the highest carbon emissions per dollar of economic activity, the 20 states with the most, they have 40 Senate seats, obviously. 35 of them are Republican senators. Trump carried, I believe, all but one of those 20 states. As long as we have this kind of division where the energy producing regions are sending to Washington politicians resolutely opposed to action on climate, What is the way forward in the US toward greater action? Is there a legislative pathway, or is this something that's going to have to be done at the state level and through the executive branch at the federal level?
So the first thing to remember is the states actually control most energy decisions in America already. They always have. They set the utility structures, they regulate the utilities, they determine transportation patterns, they create building codes, they can set appliance standards in many cases, and they can also begin to set efficiency standards for cars, although that's being challenged by the Trump administration. So there are now 45 governors with clean energy pledges covering 55% of America. So the transition is underway. The US CO2 emissions are generally going down, not fast enough to be sure. And there's a boom in wind and solar. I should also add that 2/3 of all renewables put in America have landed in red states, with Texas being the leader. So when you go home, the rhetoric calms down. When you talk to a governor, you get a different conversation than when you talk to a senator. I think what's happening in Washington, and it's tragic, is that there are these sort of articles of faith that you have to subscribe to be a member in good standing of the Republican Party that have nothing to do with economics or human health or the environment.
But to button up the point before we let you go, can the US get to where it needs to be? And can it lead the world to where it needs to be without a national commitment and a national plan?
We would be far better with a national commitment and a national plan. If we squander this moment, if we squander US leadership, political leadership, and if we squander our ability to innovate and compete, we are doing this country a grave disservice. And that's what's unfortunately in the federal agenda today.
Yeah. Hal Harvey, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your thoughts and your insights today. Now to look at how the world can cooperate on climate change, we are turning to Christiana Figueres. She is the former Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Christiana, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much, Ron.
As we said earlier, the pandemic has sort of been a case study on how countries around the world cannot cooperate facing a global challenge. There's been a need for transparency, coordinating, knowledge sharing, but all of that seems to have been in short supply. How would you rate the world's level of cooperation and common purpose in responding to this? And what lessons do you take from that on instilling it in the fight against climate change?
Well, I think to come to that conclusion is actually quite premature, Ron, because it's very clear that what science, in this case, health science professionals have recommended is precisely what has happened, which is a build your wall attitude. Stay at home, don't leave your home, don't leave your place of residence, close down the borders, close down events, close down meeting places. So everything that responds to an isolationist attitude, approach, and measures is exactly what health professionals have recommended in order to control the spread of the pandemic. That is not the end of the story, because we will not be able to get out of this crisis, the health crisis, by simply boarding ourselves in. We know that we will not be safe until there is a vaccine that can cover global population. As long as there's one person carrying the virus, everyone is under threat. So that's the second stage of dealing with the pandemic, which is how are we going to get to a global vaccine? And that is the second stage that we will be very soon entering, where it is going to be absolutely critical to reach beyond our borders, beyond, certainly beyond national efforts, to a collaborative effort that will develop the vaccine as quickly as possible, get it through all the testing that is necessary, and then produce enough of it and at a price that makes it accessible to everyone. That can only be done through international collaboration. That phase of dealing with the health crisis will be a very interesting, I would say, opportunity to exercise the muscle of international collaboration, which is critical for climate change.
Yeah.
So, I don't think that we can conclude that that we've only been isolationists now with the health pandemic, because we're not through it yet.
If you look at the climate experience, where we have been the most successful at joining the nations of the world in common purpose, what have been the key ingredients of that may be necessary if you look forward toward cooperation on the vaccine? What are the key ingredients toward getting everybody kind of rowing in the same direction?
Well, there are several things. On climate change, I think one of the factors of success of the Paris Agreement was to turn the logic around, the logic that we had inherited from the previous instrument, the Kyoto Protocol, which was an argument that I would characterize as exclusively top-down. And that was an argument that went, this is what the world needs, and now we're going to parse out the responsibility according to certain factors, and everybody will shoulder a piece of that responsibility. In the Paris Agreement, we turned that around and we said, wait. Let's first examine what the national enlightened self-interest is, and can everyone go home and figure out, what do you want to do from your national development perspective, from your sustainable development long-term perspective? What do you want to do for your own country first? And then identify the sweet spot that overlaps your enlightened self-interest with the global need. And that was a very different approach. And interestingly enough, we're basically at that point again now with the health pandemic, where every nation is certainly interested in getting beyond this and in getting vaccine for their people, but there is a global need as well. So there is a combination. These two things are not mutually exclusive. There is a combination between what is important for me as a nation or as one constituency, but also what is the global context that is going to allow me to do better than the level that I would reach by exclusively a national approach.
You've obviously had the delay in the 26th Conference of Parties meeting this year. If you look more broadly, overall, how would you say the pandemic is affecting the progress of the world efforts against climate change?
Well, as has been discussed by Hal and by Ernie, there is a surprising unintended consequence, which has already been quantified by the International Energy Agency, which is that we will drop 8% of emissions this year. So that is an unintended consequence. The good news around it is that there is an 8% drop, and that in order to get to half of the emissions by 2030, which is what science is actually telling us we must do, the annualized drop has to be 7.6. So just in this year, we've already exceeded the annualized drop that we should have. However, the drop this year should not be a matter for celebration, because we have not decarbonized the economy, we've only paralyzed the economy. And as soon as the wheels get moving again, those emissions will go up. That is why it is so critical, and Ernie and Hal have already touched upon this, it is so critical to understand that while these two crises, the health crisis and the climate crisis, have collided against each other or over each other, it is equally important to converge the solutions and to understand that the recovery packages that are already at 15 trillion and will definitely go to 20, if not more, that those recovery packages have to keep carbon efficiency and the creation of jobs and social inclusion, by the way, as some of the very, very important factors to be designed into that recovery. If we do that, we will have advanced more on the climate crisis and on the inequality crisis, in addition to meeting the health crisis, more than we would have done under any non-pandemic circumstances.
Beyond the government spending and the effort to kind of rejuvenate these economies, are there other ways in which you think the pandemic will change the way we live that could in the long run be beneficial in the fight against climate change?
Many, many, many. I mean, honestly, first of all, we have to understand that one thing that we have seen is that policy measures, i.e. systemic changes in a global threat, are critical, but so are individual behavioral changes. And the combination of those two things is actually the secret sauce to be able to address global threats. But what thing, so I hope that we will remember that once we go back out into the streets. But there are so many factors that hopefully will be sticky. Airline travel, definitely very, very transformed. You and I will not be willing to get onto a plane and travel around the planet three times to a meeting that lasts 1 hour or 2 or even 4. So we will say, no, thank you. Just give me a Zoom and I will participate. Business travel will definitely be transformed. Corporations will save an awful lot on business travel, and they can invest in much better virtual communication technology. The ICT companies are investing in much better of that technology, and that will eat into business travel costs and into business travel emissions. Now, that's just airline travel, but commuting will also be severely affected or positively affected, because so many people are realizing actually you can be just as effective or almost just as effective and productive from home. And so you don't have to put up with the lengthy and the polluting commute. You can actually work from home, and corporations will realize they can actually save money on office space.
You know, I was going to ask you there.
100%.
I was going to jump in there because there is a countervailing concern among some that this will lead to deconcentration, people wanting to move away from city, being more reluctant to live in cities where there is more opportunity for mass transit or walking.
Yes,
and
well, I mean,
the advocates in the US are saying everybody should now be moving out into kind of rural South Dakota.
Yeah, well, I mean, either it's a concern or it's good news, depending on which way you see it, because it definitely will improve quality of life when you can be closer to nature and not surrounded by cement all the time. I think that leads to quality of life of adults and certainly to quality of life of children. And if you're still participating actively in the economy through your home office, there is actually no downside to that. So that is another, thing that might be changed. Those rates of accelerated urbanization, global and universal urbanization that we had, maybe we won't follow that trajectory.
Questions from our viewers. Do we need, Nancy Grove from Ashland, Oregon, your best bet on how to get sovereign nations to cooperate on carbon pricing, especially can we avoid the solution of tariffs for non-cooperators? Where do you come out on that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously one of the threats that is being considered by some for those countries that don't want to put a carbon price is tax border adjustment, which is, to punish any goods that come into a country that does have a carbon price, punish the goods that come in from countries that don't have it. I'm not sure that that is actually going to become a reality, but it's an interesting threat. And it's a threat that China has actually been speaking about, especially now in the trade wars that they're having with the United States. I'm not sure that that's the best way of doing this. I actually think if we can realize that carbon efficiency is a responsibility for sure. But if we can begin to realize that carbon efficiency of both goods and services of all production lines is actually to our benefit, and is something that is going to create more jobs, is going to give us much more certainty in the economy, is going to give us much more resilience in the economy, then we don't have to exercise these sticks, and we can actually walk into this much more with a carrot mentality.
Abid asks, what is this? You talked about this a little bit before, but maybe drill down just a touch. What is the single most effective policy that should be part of governments who want to align climate and COVID recovery packages? What is the most important thing for them to include?
Recovery packages. For sure, there is nothing more important. Any measure, any expectation, any imagination that we had about how climate efforts would progress with policies, with carbon price, and, with agreements and with alignment between national and subnational policies, on and on and on, even with technology advance, none of that adds up to the similar impact of the recovery packages because of the scale and the speed with which these will be deployed. $20 trillion of fresh money into the economy definitely marks the context, the structure, and the logic of the economy for at least a decade. And here's the critical part. It not only marks the economy for the decade, but it marks the economy for the specific decade in which, from a climate perspective, we have to get to 1/2 emissions over that decade. So there is a total overlap there, and we have to keep that front and center.
Let me ask you this. Put it charitably, the U.S. has been absent from the international climate process for the last few years. Two-part question. What has been the impact of that U.S. withdrawal from the process? And what would be the implications on the world's ability to meet that 50% reduction for 2030 if, in fact, we have 4 more years of American lack of participation in this effort?
Well, to your first question, it's actually quite a sad answer. And it's sad on 2 accounts. The first, because it has been a rather suicidal measure on the part of the United States to leave the advance of technology, of those technologies that are the technologies that are going to make countries competitive in the 21st century, to leave that space completely open to others who have very willingly stepped in, such as China and India. So very suicidal on the part of the United States. From an international perspective, it's actually quite sad to realize that the United States has made itself sadly irrelevant to climate policy. The opinions expressed by federal US representatives are not really taken very seriously because it is evident that they do not come from a thoughtful place. So that's very sad. I'm not a US citizen, but I lived there for 20 years, and it's very sad for me to see that the United States has become so irrelevant. As Hal already said, actually, for the numbers of decarbonization of the United States, it hasn't been, no, I think it was Ernie who mentioned this, it hasn't been so catastrophic because there's so much else there that has buffered the federal blindness of this opportunity, whether it is cities or whether it is states or whether it's corporations that have continued to decarbonize because they understand that it is best for their own interest. So hasn't been so dramatic. For the numbers of the reductions of the United States had the largest reduction of emissions last year over all other countries. Now, to your second question, 4 more years of this. I think that would have a dramatic effect, certainly on the competitiveness of the United States, but also on international efforts, because the leadership of the United States has always been the flag that has been planted in order to meet ambitious goals. And for the United States to abdicate that role in inspiring and in collaborating with other countries, I think what we would see is gradual progress, but not the accelerated progress that we need to see. It will not stop progress, right? Because the decarbonization of the economy has economic reasons that stand alone and aside from politics, but it will definitely slow down the efforts.
Well, Christiana, thank you for joining us all the way from Costa Rica, I should mention, without having to go through various airports and changing planes. So we appreciate you being with us, and we appreciate all your insights today. Thank you. Now, for our final conversation on climate justice and human rights, we are honored to welcome Mary Robinson, who served as the President of Ireland from 1990 to 1997, the first woman to hold that post. She served as United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002, and she is currently chair of the Elders, an independent group founded by Nelson Mandela in 2007 of global leaders working together for peace, justice, and human rights. And it is a good day anytime you can be in the same sentence as Nelson Mandela. So, Mary Robinson, thank you for being here with us.
It's a great pleasure. I've been following very closely what Ernie and Hal and my sister Christiana have been saying. It's been a very good panel. I don't know what you're going to ask me.
Well, let me start. Throughout this hour, we've returned to the relationship between climate change and the pandemic. You've talked about the link between human rights and climate change. The people who suffer the most from climate change are those who don't have the means to escape catastrophe or to rebuild afterward. The same really could be said of COVID, I think. Will the pandemic leave us with a world facing greater inequality? And is that what lies ahead as well if we don't deal with climate change?
It's very interesting. Last January, I was almost in despair because we were facing this 2020 year when countries had to increase their ambition. And I didn't see that ambition, least of all from the United States, but actually quite across the board, it wasn't really serious enough. And then we had this immediate crisis. And, let me actually, if I may, just talk about the layers of climate injustice, because we don't think about that enough. I think there are probably about 5 layers of climate injustice. The first layer is that the countries that are least responsible and the communities least responsible are disproportionately affected because of where they live. Small island states, poor countries in Africa, etc. The second layer is the gender dimension. It affects women much more than men. It affects because they don't have as much power, because they have different roles, because they have limited access to land, to assets, etc. The third dimension, the children reminded us of, the intergenerational injustice. Greta Thunberg and the millions of children, the intergenerational. The fourth is a very important one. It's the injustice of the pathways to development. The rich countries, Europe and the United States and Japan, South Korea, etc., we built our economies on fossil fuel and we're trying to wean them off now. But the poorer countries have to get their people out of poverty. They claimed before Paris in their nationally determined contributions that they would try to do it with clean energy if they got the investment and the skills and the training, etc. And they really didn't. We didn't reach out enough. And so that's a problem. And the fifth layer is the injustice towards nature, that we have undermined the ecosystems that sustain us, the extinction of species, the loss of biodiversity. We are stupid as human beings in how we have lived with nature. So all of that is the injustice that's combined.
When you talk about all those layers of injustice, let me tie it back and ask you, do you think the world that this pandemic leaves us is going to exacerbate or point us in a direction to ameliorate those problems?
I think it will help us.
You do?
For a couple of reasons. First of all, we've learned that people power matters. Our collective staying at home, being locked down, because we care about those more vulnerable, like me, I'm an elder, and the care workers, the health workers, those who have to provide the essential services. So it's our collective behavior is the only thing now. We've no vaccine. So that's the only thing saving us from a worse crisis. Secondly, we're listening to the science. Even in the United States, where people were not listening to climate science enough, if I may say so, they're now listening to the health, I hope, enough. I'm hearing, doubts about that at the highest level, but that's a problem. But actually, states are listening to the science, and that's important. Thirdly, compassion. We're seeing more neighborliness. I'm reading about it all over the United States, what neighbors are doing to help those more affected, a real empathy. We did not have that for the climate victims. Far, far more people have died from climate change than are dying from COVID-19, far more, from the huge impacts globally, and we didn't listen or care, etc. So now we have an empathy. I don't think that will go away. And I hope we'll kind of reflect more on what is essential. Health systems are essential for countries. Education systems are essential for countries. Let's get back to the basics of what we need in this reflective time where we're all locked in our homes. School children are young. I'm deprived of my grandchildren at the moment. I can't hug them. All the strange world we're in. It does affect how we think about the future.
I want to ask you a version of what I asked Christiana. What does this leave you more encouraged or more daunted about the prospect of international cooperation on climate change? What are you learning from this very searing episode about what it will take to sustain a joint global effort?
I have a strange answer to that. As I said, I was almost in despair, trying not to show it in January. I'm less in despair now, but I would never have wished COVID on us, because it's so terrible. But actually, it has disrupted completely our lives, and we couldn't have continued with business as usual. It was going to lead us to disaster. And we had these children, millions of them, coming out all around the world and saying, please, please, listen to the science. And we weren't, frankly.
Yes.
So now we're in a mess of each country, each community, each town, each city, pretty devastated, but it's not equal. What I'm really aware of is that COVID-19 has exacerbated the inequalities in our world. And if I may use a word as a woman that we use a lot, intersectionality.
Mm-hmm.
There is a connection between poverty, gender, race, marginalization, being indigenous, being somebody with disability, being a refugee, an asylum seeker. It's worse and worse and worse. It's worse in the countries for lockdown where you have informal economy, where you work for the food of the day. And if you don't work, you've no food. So you're pretty close to starvation now in a lot of lockdown homes. Think of women locked down in their homes with abusive partners and abusive children, children being abused. We're seeing a lot of that. Think of children being out of school, girls being out of school and being now married off in huge numbers as child brides. This is the world we're living in now. It's not a great leveler. There's a huge inequality in this, but it's also opening up space for empathy about how, as a human race, we can build back better.
We have a question from Lauren, who is a UCD student in Ireland for the president. And it's one that's really relevant in a lot of countries, because she asks, how can we persuade our legislature to approach climate change as urgently as they have approached COVID-19? That goes to something I think a lot of people are wondering. This was something that was here, immediate, undeniable, right in front of you. Climate change unfolds over many months, many years. How do we transfer the sense of urgency that we've seen on this?
Well, I think, in fairness, I think all three panelists before me spoke to this issue in one way or another. It is the looming crisis that we had in January, looming over us, an existential crisis, which the COVID-19 isn't. COVID-19 will be with us. We'll get a vaccine, I hope, and sooner the better, but we'll deal with it like we dealt with, the terrible flu, and we deal with other things. We'll get over it. If we didn't deal with the climate crisis, we would not exist as a human species. And that's what the children understood. That was the intergenerational dialogue. They were saying to us, we're just children. For goodness sake, listen to the scientists. They marched all over the United States, all over the world, in order to tell us. Like, now we have, I think, two crises that are completely interrelated. We have to get out of COVID in a way that helps us to get out of climate, meaning go green, and do it in a way that also links with developing countries. We cannot tackle this on our own. You were asked earlier about the international dimension. As chair of the elders, I care about that a lot. I think about that a lot. We're not in a good time of international cooperation, but surely COVID-19 has taught us, if we don't help the poorest countries with their health systems to cope with this, it will come back to all of us. This is an interconnected world. It's a fragile world. So we have to actually have more solidarity. And we've had frameworks of solidarity. If I may just mention, because I was the special envoy of the Secretary General before the Paris Agreement, and I watched the 193 countries, including the United States, conclude the 2030 agenda with its 17 Sustainable Development Goals, talking about human rights, gender equality, and leave no one behind, solidarity. And then the Paris Agreement, and that too, as Christiana has said, the world came together.
I don't think I'm mischaracterizing your views to say that on climate, you have counseled for more impatience, not more patience. I want to read a quote so everyone can hear it. You've got to get angry with those with more responsibility who are not doing enough, you have said. Governments, business, especially fossil fuel business, agriculture, transportation, communities, everybody that should be doing more. Why do you think we need more impatience?
I have to tell you a funny story, if I may. I was marching at the big global march in 2014 before the first climate summit of the UN with Gru Brundtland of the elders, who's a fellow elder with me. And out of it, we couldn't even move because 400,000 people had marched in New York. We were shuffling along very slowly. And out of a side corridor came women with a banner that said "Angry Grannies." And I thought, I want to join Angry Grannies. And it's that sense at this stage of my life. I want a future for my own grandchildren. They will be in their 30s and 40s in 2050. They will share the world with more than 9 billion, maybe 9.5 billion. That huge increase. How will that work? This was on my mind before COVID. It's on my mind even more now. I think we can learn the lessons of being a human race, of being fragile in our humanity. We've made mistakes because we haven't lived well with nature. We have, sort of used the extraction of coal, oil, gas to fuel our economies. We mustn't do that anymore. We have to get out of that. I'm reading that, there is a proposal for a 750 billion bond for fossil fuel companies. We need fossil fuel in the intermediate for a just transition, but we must be very careful not to give it to fossil fuel companies unless they commit to the transition to clean energy. That to me is vital.
We have a terrific question from Chantel, which might be a good way to kind of sum up the whole day. What is the best way for the average person to make a difference on this issue?
The average person is making a difference on COVID. Let's think about that. So the average person is a consumer. The average person is a voter. The average person actually has a lot of power just going forward in this very uncertain time that we're in, where those who have the responsibility at government level or at business level for policies have to listen to what people are really feeling about our world. The COVID-19 is a huge correction to a business as usual, which was leading us to extinction. I'm afraid. And I really believe that. If you look at the science, if we had continued on that path, we had no recovery possible. So we're learning that we have to, and there's so much good going on in business that is leading this, and including United States business leaders, Salesforce and lots of others. I'm on the B team of business leaders, and they're doing terrific work. I'm full of hope about it. I actually learned from Desmond Tutu, the first chair of the elders that I now chair, that he was accused of being an optimist. He said, no, I'm not an optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope. And I think that's the way forward, to be prisoners of hope, to deal with the issues we deal with and to move forward.
Well, Madam President, I think if there were all 1,000 or so people on the broadcast could speak right now, they would agree that was just an incisive and even exhilarating presentation. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts with us, as well as your outstanding bookcases. I want to thank all of our husbands.
They're my husband's bookcases.
Yes. Well, thank you, and thank your husband, and thank all of our speakers for joining us again today. Thanks to our underwriter, the Churchill Capital Corp, for supporting this program, and thanks most of all to all of you out there for spending an hour of your day with us today. I'm Ron Brownstein with The Atlantic, and we'll see you next week for the next installment of The Way Forward. Thanks again to all of our speakers. Bye-bye.